In a congressional hearing broadcast to over 42 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stares down Elon Musk, the tech titan accused of building his green empire on the broken backs of underpaid workers and poisoned neighborhoods. As Musk defends his empire with bold claims and dismissive smirks, Crockett strikes back with chilling reports of environmental destruction and rising illness near his factories. The hearing spirals into chaos, reputations tremble, and one explosive exchange changes everything. When power meets truth in the nation's highest chamber, who will the people believe? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At exactly 9 a.m., the doors to the congressional hearing room thundered open as Jasmine Crockett stepped through in a sharply tailored black suit, her heels clicking like a war drum on the polished marble floor. She wasn't just walking into a room, she was entering a battlefield, representing thousands of families whose children wheezed through poisoned air and whose wells now ran with metallic tang. Jasmine carried more than papers. She carried testimony carved in suffering. Her eyes were steel, jaw set, every step pulsing with righteous defiance. These were not theoretical debates for her. These were mothers bearing children, workers coughing blood, schools evacuated due to chemical burns in the soil. As she took her seat, her gaze locked forward, toward the man who, in her mind, symbolized the cold detachment of unchecked power. Elon Musk sat reclined, smirking, as if the lives crushed beneath his empire were acceptable collateral in the name of innovation. Cameras rolled. The air was tight, heavy, and electric. In that moment, it wasn't just a hearing, it was Judgment Day. Across the room, Elon Musk adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back like a king forced to humor a peasant rebellion. He wasn't intimidated, he was annoyed. To him, this was political theater, a stage where uninformed populace took aim at progress they didn't understand. SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink. He saw them as humanity's salvation. So what if a few towns suffered some unintended consequences? Musk viewed Jasmine not as a legislator, but as a loud voice clinging to outdated notions of fairness. "Let's get this over with," he muttered under his breath, the condescension rolling off him like static. He didn't see her fire, only noise. But Jasmine knew what he didn't. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to expose. And no amount of money, Mars missions, or smirking disdain could save him from what she had brought to the table. As the gavel slammed, the war began, not with shouts, but with a silence so loaded it nearly cracked the walls. But Crockett wasn't there for theater. She was there to peel back the polished veneer of innovation and reveal the rot beneath. And when she began, she did not raise her voice. She let the facts do the screaming. She called up a series of satellite images on the main monitor. The first was from 5 years ago. Nevada's Clayton Valley, serene, its salt flats shimmering like silver under a desert sun. The next showed its present state, scarred, hollowed, bleeding. Massive lithium extraction fields stretched for miles, machines slicing into the crust of the earth like surgical knives turned reckless. "This," Jasmine said, voice low but taut as wire, "is the cost of Elon Musk's battery dreams." She moved swiftly. Argentina's Salinas Grandes, once a sacred salt plain, now a pale wasteland leaching arsenic into groundwater. Bolivia's Salar de Uyuni, a marvel of nature, now fractured by pump lines and containment pools where flamingos no longer fly. These weren't isolated industrial zones. These were living ecosystems Musk's empire had treated like parts warehouses. Each map flickering behind her was another indictment. Then came the air no one could breathe. In Fremont, California, the air around Tesla's flagship gigafactory tested positive for particulate matter levels well above EPA limits. Musk promised zero emissions, Jasmine snapped, but he forgot to mention the communities choking on the price of that promise. The next slide, zip codes near Giga Texas, where airborne VOCs, volatile organic compounds, had spiked since SpaceX expanded its launch testing. Crockett read the lab results aloud. Benzene, toluene, formaldehyde, all carcinogens. Then she paused, eyes steady. "This isn't progress. This is chemical warfare by spreadsheet." She stepped forward and switched to human cost. A school nurse's logbook from Hidalgo County was entered into the record. 12 children hospitalized in a single month for unexplained nosebleeds and dizziness. Another file detailed rising asthma diagnoses in Cameron Parish, Louisiana, near a lithium processing site backed by a Musk affiliate. One small girl, Amaya Rivera, age 9, had collapsed during recess. Her father's testimony followed, voice shaking as he wrote, "No one told us the new facility would poison the wind." The hearing room fell silent. No rebuttal, just the cold, ticking metronome of accountability. But Jasmine wasn't finished. "These people," she said, "don't get NDAS. They don't get press teams. They don't have the luxury of calling destruction disruption. They get nosebleeds, birth defects, cancer." Her tone had shifted, not rage, not even despair, but something sharper, clarity laced with sorrow. "Your future, Mr. Musk," she said coldly, "is being built on lungs that never consented." And just like that, the myth cracked. And if the poisoned land wasn't enough, Jasmine turned to the part of the story that couldn't be paved over or spun with press releases. What it had done to human flesh, to lungs and bloodstreams, and tiny hearts that had no voice in this industrial conquest. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Instead, she placed a thick folder onto the table with both hands, slowly, deliberately, then flipped it open to the first page. The screen behind her lit up with a heat map glowing red. "This," she said evenly, "is not opinion. It is not activism. It is medical data, compiled over 7 years, reviewed by physicians, dismissed by investors." The map showed communities adjacent to Tesla's gigafactories, to SpaceX's launch pads, to lithium processing plants in California, Nevada, Texas. In every pocket of industry Musk had touched, another dark bloom had spread: elevated cancer clusters, aggressive respiratory illness, birth abnormalities. Jasmine zoomed in on Fremont, California. "This community," she said, tapping the screen, "has seen a 31% rise in adult-onset leukemia within a 5-mile radius of your plant since 2018. That's not a glitch. That's a body count." She changed slides. Boca Chica, Texas. Pediatric asthma cases up 240%. 8-year-olds using inhalers during recess. 4-year-olds hospitalized with collapsed lungs. Jasmine read a hospital record aloud. Child experienced acute respiratory failure after prolonged exposure to outdoor air on high-test days. There was no factory warning, no community notification, just burning throats and ER bills. She turned the page. Sparks, Nevada, a spike in glioblastoma cases among plant workers. Men in their 40s, diagnosed within months of each other. "We traced it," she said, holding up another document. "The exposure came from unshielded heavy metal dust drifting beyond factory walls. No filters, no barriers, just wind." Her voice lowered. "And profit." Then came the letter. It wasn't typed. It wasn't bound. Just 3 pages of trembling handwriting, penned by a widow whose husband had spent 5 years working a Tesla floor and 3 months dying in a hospital bed. Jasmine read it slowly. "They told him he was lucky to have the job. They never told us what was in the air." The final line, "I buried the father of my children last April. Your machines still run." Jasmine folded the letter and placed it face up before Elon Musk like a silent accusation. Her hand didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. "Your innovation," she said, "is measured in profit per share. Ours is measured in funerals per zip code." And for the first time that morning, the air in the chamber felt heavier than numbers, like grief had finally entered the room and taken a seat beside them all. And as the weight of testimony hung in the air, like a storm refusing to break, Elon Musk finally moved. Not with guilt, not with humility, but with the cool, mechanical precision of someone who believed he was still the smartest man in the room. He clasped his hands, tilted his chin ever so slightly, and began speaking not to the people but above them, as if the chamber were too small for the size of his vision. "Let's recalibrate the narrative," he said, voice smooth as brushed steel, utterly devoid of apology. "What we are building at Tesla, at SpaceX, across every venture I lead, is not destruction, it's salvation. He nodded toward the images of collapsed lungs and poisoned rivers, still flickering faintly on the congressional monitors. I don't deny there are impacts, but innovation isn't sterile. It never has been. The first railroads displaced thousands. The first power plants blackened skies. But what came after? Modernity, civilization. His eyes scanned the room, not to connect, but to assert. Electric vehicles reduce emissions. Solar roofs eliminate coal dependence. Reusable rockets will one day allow us to offload industrial processes to space, away from Earth entirely. These aren't hypotheticals, they're happening. And I won't apologize because progress made someone uncomfortable along the way. Then, as if to twist the blade into the raw nerve Jasmine had laid bare, he added with a faint smirk, frankly, most of these so-called harms are growing pains amplified by fear-mongering. The silence in the room shifted, not stunned, but seething. But Musk didn't notice. He leaned back, perfectly composed, his voice softer now, but laced with something colder. You see loss. I see trajectory. And in that moment, it wasn't just denial, it was doctrine. A worldview where graphs outweighed gravestones and futures justified everything scorched in their wake. But just when the chamber thought Elon Musk had finished defending his empire, he pivoted, calmly, deliberately, and let the contempt bleed through. His face didn't contort. It didn't need to. The precision of his insult came not in volume, but in design, like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. He turned toward Jasmine Crockett, locking eyes as if she were the only person in the room who still didn't get it. You don't understand technology, he said, each word clipped and sharp. You never have. People like you, legislators with law degrees and microphones, you're quick to judge, slow to grasp. His voice was low but carried, each syllable slicing through the quiet like a whisper in a cathedral. You speak in problem, he continued, while we, builders, thinkers, engineers, we deal in solutions. You don't code. You don't invent. You hold up charts of suffering and call it strategy, but you've never risked anything to make the world better. He leaned back in his chair slightly, satisfied, as if he'd just checked a queen with a pawn. You look at a factory and see pollution. I look at it and see the future of civilization. You obsess over symptoms. I'm curing the disease. A beat passed, intentional, suffocating. Then came the final strike. You can't see the big picture, Congresswoman, he said, voice dripping with authority, because you've never stood high enough to look. Around the room, jaws clenched. Staffers shifted. Cameras zoomed. But Musk didn't flinch. To him, this wasn't cruelty. It was clarification. A reminder to everyone watching that power, when dressed in certainty and cashmere confidence, could humiliate without ever raising its voice. And Jasmine, still silent, sat motionless, until the silence itself began to bend around her like pressure before a storm. And Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Because while Musk wielded wealth and ego like armor, she came armed with something far more dangerous, facts soaked in blood, inked in breathless diagnoses, and stitched into the lungs of forgotten people. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for the second binder, thicker than the first, its corners curled with use, its spine creased from nights poured over under hospital lights and kitchen tables. She placed it gently on the desk like a silent coffin and opened it with the care of someone who knew exactly what was buried inside. Since Mr. Musk suggests I don't understand, she said evenly, let's hear from those who do. The first slide that lit up behind her bore the stamp of the CDC, a 5-year longitudinal study mapping respiratory illnesses across 3 zip codes bordering the Gigafactory in Sparks, Nevada. The data was unforgiving. In that time frame, asthma rates among children had more than doubled. ER visits for lung inflammation had tripled. Jasmine pointed to the graph. This, she said coldly, isn't fear. It's inflammation under a microscope. She turned the page. A peer-reviewed journal article from The Lancet detailing clusters of glioblastoma, rare, aggressive brain tumors, emerging among workers at a lithium refining facility contracted by one of Musk's holding companies. These aren't aging miners, she said. They're engineers, line technicians, fathers in their 30s. She cited pathology reports from University of Texas Health, confirming high concentrations of cobalt and arsenic in blood samples from nearby residents. Then came the voices, transcripts from doctors on the ground. One pulmonologist wrote, "I've never seen this many collapsed lungs in non-smokers under 40. Another, an oncologist from El Paso, noted a pattern of rare cancers appearing with geographic consistency near extraction sites. Jasmine didn't embellish. She didn't need to. "This is not a correlation," she said. "This is a pattern. This is a signature. And that signature has Elon Musk's name all over it." She looked up, not at Musk, but at the chamber itself, daring them to ignore what was now seared into the record. "This isn't progress," she said, her voice low, steady, final. "It's a slow-motion collapse of public health, delivered beneath the noise of launch engines and the branding of brilliance." But as Jasmine's voice fell silent, her final line hanging in the air like a blade yet to drop, Elon Musk leaned forward with surgical intent, not to defend, but to diminish. He folded his hands, elbows propped neatly on the polished table, and delivered his words with the clipped precision of someone who believed intellect granted him immunity from consequence. "This," he said slowly, gesturing to the wall of evidence behind her, "is the danger of letting ideology masquerade as expertise." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The arrogance was baked into every syllable. "You stand here waving around charts and quoting studies you didn't write, about systems you don't understand. But the truth, Congresswoman, is that you don't speak the language of technology. You speak politics. You speak fear." He turned slightly, facing the panel, but never breaking eye contact with her. "You reduce generational breakthroughs to press bait and anecdote. You compare rockets to smokestacks and act shocked when the math outpaces your outrage." Then came the blade. "You see a factory and think cancer clusters," he said, voice silk-wrapped steel. "I see a global supply chain that moves humanity forward. One of us is looking at a blueprint. The other is shouting at shadows on the wall." The insult landed not just as dismissal, but as erasure, a denial not only of Jasmine's position, but of her capacity to even comprehend the world he believed he ruled. And for a breathless second, the room stopped, caught between the sterile chill of Musk's contempt and the quiet fire building behind the woman he just tried to bury in condescension. But the sting of dismissal didn't break Jasmine. It forged her into something colder, harder, more precise. She stood without hesitation, her posture straight, her hands steady on the edge of the microphone, as though bracing against the weight of centuries behind her. The silence was thick, taut as wire, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It focused, like a scalpel slicing through noise. "Let me be clear," she said, each word carved in steel. "You don't get to dress up exploitation in the language of innovation and expect it to go unchallenged." She leaned in slightly, her tone unwavering, measured, lethal. "Your vision of progress cannot come at the cost of poisoned lungs, buried children, or entire zip codes reduced to sacrifice zones. Human health is not a rounding error in your profit margins. You talk about the future as if it belongs to you, but the people gasping for air in Boca Chica, in Sparks, in Fremont, they're living in the wreckage of your present." She held up a photo, small, crumpled, a child with a nasal cannula, eyes wide with confusion. "He's not a data point. He's not a bump in your supply chain. He is the consequence of a man who thinks acceleration matters more than accountability." Her voice lowered. "So no, I'm not here for show. I'm here because someone has to say what your money tries to drown." Elon Musk didn't pause. He didn't blink. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, like a man bored of being corrected by those he deemed beneath him. His smile was thin, deliberate. "Do you even know what you're talking about?" he asked, his tone laced with casual disdain. "Or are you just doing what politicians always do, flashing outrage to stay relevant?" He tilted his head, mocking curiosity. "Seriously, Congresswoman? Do you actually know the chemical signature of lithium hydroxide? Or are you just here to make headlines?" The words weren't an argument. They were an erasure, designed to shrink her into a soundbite. What he didn't see, what he refused to see, was that her silence after that wasn't retreat. It was restraint. And restraint in the right hands was far more dangerous than rage. And as the echo of Musk's contemptuous question still smoldered in the air, "Do you even know what you're talking about?" The balance in the room shifted. Slowly, sharply. It was no longer a duel between Jasmine Crockett and Elon Musk. It was a reckoning. The atmosphere thickened, not just with tension, but with consequence. The committee had watched Musk deflect, belittle, and polish his empire with abstractions. But now one of their own was ready to strike with something Musk hadn't prepared for: direct accountability. Representative Leonard Hartley, a seasoned legislator from Pennsylvania's 7th District, leaned forward with measured calm. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Mr. Musk," he began, speaking slowly so the cameras and stenographers wouldn't miss a single word, "can you provide to this committee any concrete, independently verified data that guarantees the safety of the communities currently living in the shadow of your industrial operations?" He paused. "Specifically, I'm asking whether you or your companies have submitted environmental and public health safety reports, verified by third-party medical or environmental experts, that show no significant adverse health effects linked to your projects." The chamber went still. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was clinical, unforgiving, the kind that demanded not philosophy, but paper. Musk shifted. A flicker, barely perceptible, passed across his face. It was gone in less than a second, but it was real. He leaned into the microphone, but there was hesitation in the movement, as if for the first time he wasn't sure if what he had to say would land. "We, of course, take safety very seriously," he began, voice still even, but lacking its earlier force. "We've conducted internal assessments across multiple facilities, Tesla, SpaceX, and others, looking at emissions controls, containment systems, and exposure thresholds." He glanced down at his notes. A pause. "Our teams are working on sustainability metrics that align with evolving global standards. We're developing frameworks for long-term safety compliance." Hartley didn't blink. "That's not what I asked," he said. "You mentioned internal assessments. That's fine. But have those assessments been reviewed and confirmed by any independent scientific body? Any public health institution? Any environmental watchdog not paid by your companies?" A longer pause. Musk's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the desk. He looked briefly to the right, toward his legal counsel, who offered nothing but a blank stare in the absence of a lifeline. The room was silent except for the soft hum of equipment and the scribbling of journalists. Musk tried again, this time faster but less composed. "We've initiated contact with several review boards. Some of those dialogues are ongoing. There are reports in the pipeline, some under peer review, others pending publication." His voice thinned. "These things take time. There's a process." Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The absence of her voice in that moment made her presence heavier than ever, because the question wasn't even hers, and still, the answer felt like her vindication. Hartley pressed once more. "Let me be even more specific," he said. "Can you, right now, provide this committee with a single published, independently verified health study showing that proximity to your gigafactories, launch sites, or refining operations has not resulted in statistically significant harm to nearby residents?" Musk sat back slightly. The mask had not shattered, but it had cracked. He adjusted his collar, cleared his throat, and, finally, admitted what the room already knew. "Not at this time," he said quietly. "But we are working toward transparency." The words dropped like stones into the chamber. "Not at this time." In an instant, the posture of the room shifted. Staffers took note. Lawmakers exchanged glances. Jasmine lowered her eyes, not in defeat, but in calm, quiet affirmation. For all the billions Musk had funneled into propulsion and automation, he could not produce a single, clean document that proved he wasn't harming the very people he claimed to uplift. His equations didn't include them. His vision had moved too far ahead to account for those he'd left coughing in the dust behind him. And in that moment, without theatrics or fury, Elon Musk, architect of the future, was exposed as a man unprepared for the moral calculus of the present. And the moment Elon Musk uttered those 5 brittle words, "Not at this time," something shifted in the room, almost imperceptibly at first. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly from her seat, the weight of everything she had witnessed now boiling beneath her ribs. But there was no trembling in her stance, no chaos in her expression, only control, cold, precise, coiled like thunder just before it splits the sky. She approached the mic not like a politician, but like a surgeon preparing the final incision. "Let the record show," she began, her voice firm and deliberate, "that the man with the power to reroute satellites, to tunnel beneath cities, to launch rockets beyond our atmosphere, cannot provide a single document to prove his companies haven't harmed the people who breathe next to his factories." The chamber froze. Even the air conditioning seemed to fall silent, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Jasmine's eyes swept the panel, not for permission, but to deliver a challenge they could no longer look away from. "I am submitting a formal request," she continued, sliding a heavy folder across the table, the cover marked boldly, "Urgent motion for federal environmental and public health oversight. We are calling for a comprehensive, independent investigation into the full public health impact of every industrial site operated or contracted by Mr. Musk companies. I'm talking gigafactories, launch pads, refineries, satellite nodes, lithium mines, every footprint he has left on American soil and beyond." Her hand didn't move from the document. It was as if she were pressing it into the conscience of the room. This is not political theater. This is legislative obligation. This is about lives. She turned, addressing the room, not just her colleagues, but the invisible millions she carried in her voice. "For too long, we've allowed the myth of progress to outshout the screams of the people it tramples. We've let PR departments rewrite the definition of harm. We've let quarterly profits speak louder than rising cancer rates." Her tone intensified, not louder, but heavier. "That ends now. We will no longer let communities near these facilities be treated as disposable testing grounds for industrial ambition. We will not let high-tech pollution be excused as innovation." She reached into the binder and pulled out several sealed envelopes. "These are signed testimonies from pediatricians, emergency room nurses, environmental toxicologists, and grieving parents. I'm asking the Oversight Committee to subpoena Elon Musk's environmental reports, internal health assessments, insurance disclosures, and all communications regarding safety mitigation. If those documents don't exist, that's not an oversight. It's a crime in slow motion." There was a brief pause, and then her voice dropped, not in force, but in intimacy, as if she were suddenly speaking to one person, a mother, a worker, a child watching from a living room where the walls shake every time a rocket fires from a few miles away. "I've walked through these towns. I've breathed the ash they breathe. I've seen playgrounds empty by noon because the air becomes unbreathable. I've met a 10-year-old with the lungs of a 70-year-old coal miner, and I will not, under any circumstance, allow those stories to be buried beneath spreadsheets and shareholder slides." She faced Musk once more, not with anger, but with unflinching certainty. "Mr. Musk," she said quietly, "if you want to lead humanity into the future, you're going to have to prove you're not killing it on the way there." Then she turned back to the panel. "And to my colleagues, if we fail to act now, we are complicit. If we let this go unexamined, we send a message to every corporation in America that people are cheaper than silence, that science is negotiable, that wealth can purchase immunity from responsibility. We are not here to regulate ambition. We are here to protect life." There were no cheers, no applause, just silence, thick, cold, and righteous. And in that silence, for the first time all morning, Elon Musk looked like a man not ahead of the moment, but caught inside it. And as Jasmine's final sentence landed, "We are not here to regulate ambition. We are here to protect life," the tension in the hearing room crystallized into something sharper, colder, and unmistakably real. For hours, the weight of testimony had accumulated like storm clouds. Images of sick children, silenced workers, poisoned air, and now lightning struck. The political theater Musk had expected had become something far more dangerous, federal machinery awakening. It was Representative Ellen McCready, moderate Democrat from Colorado, known for her caution and long silences, who spoke first. But this time, there was no hesitation. Her voice cut clean through the static. Madam Chair, she began, her fingers resting firmly on a thick folder stamped Environmental Subcommittee findings. I move that this chamber formally initiate a full, independent federal investigation into the environmental and public health consequences of all industrial projects owned, funded, or contracted by Mr. Elon Musk and his affiliated companies. The sentence didn't rise like applause. It dropped like a verdict. The room froze. Even Elon Musk, who had previously leaned back with his signature detachment, now subtly adjusted forward. A shift, small but undeniable. The chairwoman, sensing the weight of the moment, glanced briefly around the dais. Without raising her gavel, she asked, "Do we have a second?" A beat of silence. Then Senator Worth, a Republican from Ohio, with a long-standing record of supporting private innovation, cleared his throat. "I second the motion," he said plainly. His tone wasn't theatrical. It was resigned, inevitable. Two more voices followed before the next breath. One Democrat, one independent, and then came the gavel. Three precise, echoing strikes, not symbolic, binding. The resolution was passed. And in that instant, the myth of Elon Musk, the untouchable genius, the world builder above reproach, began to collapse under the gravity of a system he could not algorithm his way out of. The headlines were immediate, cascading like aftershocks through digital networks. Congress launches formal investigation into Musk's environmental record government to probe health risks from Tesla, SpaceX facilities. Musk summoned for compliance under Federal Health Act, Section 421B. What followed was the procedural equivalent of a noose tightening. The committee voted to authorize full subpoena power, granted to independent, federally appointed environmental scientists, epidemiologists, and public health attorneys. No internal review boards, no corporate hired consultants, no sealed settlements. Jasmine had made it clear in her proposal. This investigation would involve direct field testing, on-site inspections of Musk's industrial complexes, and full release of internal memos, incident reports, environmental audits, and employee medical records dating back at least 10 years. Every cough, every leak, every chemical used, every silence bought. And for the first time, Elon Musk didn't speak. He sat still, fingers folded tightly beneath the table, his mouth a thin line. There were no more jokes, no smirks, no jabs about poetry and rocket science. The room, which had once bent slightly toward his gravity, had turned on its axis. And the pressure wasn't coming from just one woman anymore. It was coming from the system he had always dismissed as slower, weaker, irrelevant. Now it was breathing down his neck. The injustice Jasmine had carried alone for the first half of the hearing had erupted into collective outrage. Lawmakers who once hesitated now voiced calls for transparency. Reporters surged from their benches, thumbs flying over phone screens, eyes wide as the story exploded in real time. Outside, protests that had begun as quiet picket lines outside the Capitol gates grew louder. One banner read, "Progress without poison." Another, "We are not your collateral." And as the official terms of the investigation were read into the record, complete with federal enforcement clauses and a 90-day compliance deadline, Musk looked not like a visionary under siege, but like a man finally pulled from the future and made to answer for the present. The chairwoman turned her attention back to him one final time. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice like stone, "you will be expected to comply fully with this order. Any attempt to obstruct, withhold, or delay access to information will be considered grounds for contempt under federal code. This is not a request, it is law." Still, Musk said nothing. Jasmine Crockett, seated once more but unbowed, looked at him, not with triumph, but with the grim recognition of what it took to get here. It had taken mothers crying in front of microphones, doctors risking careers to speak the truth, a child's photograph laid bare beside quarterly reports. It had taken everything, and still the cost was incalculable. But now the wheels were turning, not to punish for punishment's sake, but to reclaim a truth lost in the noise of ambition, that no man, no matter how powerful, gets to soar above the law while others choke on the dust his empire leaves behind. And as the gavel fell and the investigation was set in motion, something even more unstoppable began to stir. Not within the marble walls of Congress, but far beyond them. The halls of power had moved. Now the streets would rise. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the border town of Brownsville, Texas, where mothers gathered in a church basement across from a SpaceX facility. They had watched for years as the launches roared above them, shaking their walls, rattling their windows, and coating their gardens in a fine layer of dust no one could explain. Their children were coughing more. Rashes were appearing. Local clinics had no answers. That night they passed around manila folders, medical records, soil samples, ultrasound scans. One woman stood up and whispered, "Enough." The next morning, they filed the first class action lawsuit against Elon Musk's companies, citing environmental negligence, chemical exposure, and long-term health deterioration. Within 48 hours, it had been joined by more than 700 residents and counting. News of the lawsuit spread like fire through dry brush. In Sparks, Nevada, former employees of the Tesla Gigafactory, many of whom had signed NDAs years prior, began speaking to legal representatives under whistleblower protections. One man came forward with documented reports of internal safety violations buried by management. Another had images of corroded ventilation systems coated in particulate matter. A third had his son's medical records, age 6, diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. "We never had cancer in our family," he told a reporter. Then came the factory. By the end of the week, multiple legal teams, environmental justice firms, labor rights groups, and medical advocacy coalitions had merged into a national legal front. Their name, the Clean Earth Accountability Network. Their mission, to take Elon Musk and every corporate entity tied to him to court. Across the country, the response became kinetic. In Fremont, California, protesters formed a human chain around Tesla's plant gates, blocking morning shipments. Many of them weren't activists. They were teachers, retired nurses, warehouse workers, and teenage students holding handmade signs that read, "Innovation Immunity" and "We breathe what you profit from." In Delano, New Mexico, a mobile billboard drove through neighborhoods showing side-by-side images, one of a shiny Tesla Model X, the other of a 9-year-old girl on a ventilator. Beneath it read the words, "She never consented." The protest grew bolder. In Chicago, hundreds staged a die-in at a Tesla showroom, lying still on the floor for 7 minutes, each minute representing a community on the current investigation docket. In New York, thousands marched across the Brooklyn Bridge, holding black and white portraits of children who had died near suspected contamination zones. In Atlanta, a group hacked a billboard above the downtown connector to flash, "Elon, we're not disposable." Pressure mounted in every direction. State attorneys, general from California, Texas, and New Mexico, announced they would be reviewing potential violations of state-level environmental codes. Health departments in multiple counties released open letters warning residents to avoid contact with groundwater near known facilities. Insurance companies quietly began reassessing liability exposure for property owners near Musk-linked zones, spooking real estate markets and panicking investors. Meanwhile, independent environmental watchdogs launched new investigations, using infrared drones, air quality balloons, and soil analysis to document conditions around every single Musk operation on U.S. soil. And through it all, the human stories flooded in. Parents clutching photographs, workers with oxygen tanks, teachers showing charts of unexplained absences, tribal leaders demanding restitution for land poisoned without consultation. Children too young to testify, but old enough to bear the scars. It wasn't a campaign, it was a wave. And Jasmine Crockett's name was now chanted beside theirs, not as a savior, but as a spark. One mother said it on national television. "We saw what she did in that hearing. She didn't just speak for us, she made us speak for ourselves." Musk's team scrambled to respond. Press conferences were hastily organized. PR campaigns were reactivated. A new ad aired during prime time. Slow shots of solar panels, children running through wind farms, a gentle narrator saying, "We build for a better tomorrow." But by then, the truth had legs. The voices were louder. The lawsuits were multiplying. And the protests had gone global. Demonstrations sparked in Berlin, Shanghai, Cape Town. All different languages, all the same chant. "We are not the cost of progress." And somewhere in the center of it, the man who once promised to save the planet was now being asked to answer for how much of it he had already sacrificed. And as the lawsuits stacked, the protests surged, and headlines no longer bent in his favor, the pressure reached a point no engineer could calculate, no algorithm could diffuse. Elon Musk, for the first time in years, was forced to stop talking and start listening. He appeared at a hastily assembled press conference in Austin, Texas. No flashy stage, no gleaming prototype behind him, just a podium, a federal flag, and eyes that for once were not worshipful, but waiting. The man who once dismissed criticism as noise now stood behind a microphone, flanked by silence, not applause. Cameras snapped. Protesters outside chanted his name with fury, not awe. He adjusted his collar, exhaled slowly, and looked down at the speech in his hands as if the weight of it might crush the empire he built. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, not because they feared what he might do, but because they didn't know if he was capable of humility. But then he spoke, measured, uncharacteristically subdued, with none of the bravado that usually defined him. "There's no innovation," he began, "that is worth the price of a child's health." The sentence dropped like steel into a sea of noise. Even the reporters, trained to expect corporate spin, paused. Musk continued, his voice steady but taut. "Over the past several weeks, I've heard voices I should have heard a long time ago. Parents, teachers, factory workers, communities I believed I was helping, but in reality, may have harmed." He looked up then, briefly, and the image flicked across every major news network. The world's most famous futurist acknowledging failure, not in space, but on Earth. "I won't pretend that all the allegations are accurate, and I won't accept every accusation as fact. But I also cannot deny that we have not done enough. Not to test, not to protect, not to listen." Behind him, the projection screen lit up, not with a Tesla logo, not with a rendering of Mars, but with a stark title, Environmental Restructuring and Public Health Accountability Plan, effective immediately. Musk stepped aside as a representative from the new task force. An independent coalition formed from government watchdogs, climate scientists, union health advocates, and third-party auditors approached the mic. She listed the details: a full internal review of all Tesla and SpaceX facilities, permanent air and water quality monitoring installed at every production and launch site, creation of a compensation fund for families with medically confirmed exposure-linked illnesses, and the complete suspension of operations at 3 specific plants until federal safety standards could be independently verified and met. The crowd outside roared, not in celebration, but in something closer to catharsis. Musk returned to the podium. "This isn't about blame," he said. "It's about responsibility. I built my companies to solve problems. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people as part of that equation. That changes today." He promised sweeping changes to facility design, transitioning to enclosed systems that reduce airborne particulate emissions by over 80% based on peer-reviewed filtration tech previously deemed too expensive. Battery production lines would be relocated away from residential zones, with local governments given oversight authority over zoning decisions. All environmental reports would now be made public in real time, accessible to anyone via an open data portal developed in partnership with civic tech groups. Furthermore, Musk announced the launch of a $1.2 billion Community Impact and Environmental Justice Fund, a pool financed by direct stock allocation from Tesla and SpaceX executive bonuses over the next 3 years, earmarked for remediation, healthcare, and legal assistance. And yet, even as the room began to shift, reporters softening, advisors nodding, Musk did not let himself off the hook. "There are children," he said, "already buried. There are lungs that will never fully recover. No amount of restructuring undoes that. But I hope what we do next can stop the suffering we've ignored or denied or calculated as an acceptable margin of risk." He paused, then delivered what would become the line replayed across news segments worldwide. "You cannot build the future by sacrificing the breath of the present." Outside the conference, the mood changed. The chants quieted. Some signs were lowered. A few were held higher. But for Jasmine Crockett, watching not from a seat in Congress, but from a battered community center in New Mexico, surrounded by people whose names never made the news, this wasn't a victory, it was a beginning. She listened, arms crossed, jaw tight, knowing full well that corporate apology without legal enforcement was a script America had seen too many times before. But she also knew something had cracked, something structural, something cultural. Musk hadn't conceded because he wanted to. He had conceded because truth, when carried by the people, had finally become too heavy to ignore. In the weeks that followed, the changes rolled out. Environmental task forces descended on sites long closed to the public. Medical clinics began receiving funding for treatment programs that had once been impossible to staff. School districts saw air filters delivered in crates stamped priority. Engineers at Tesla, previously silenced under NDAs, were invited to help redesign facilities with safety, not just speed as their mandate. And across the country, community leaders, some who had never held a microphone in their lives, stepped forward to serve on newly formed advisory councils that would hold the Musk empire to its promises. For the first time, innovation had to answer to humanity. And in boardrooms that once laughed off legislation, in factories where complaint once meant termination, in towns where breathing had become a risk, there was something else in the air. Accountability, not enough, but real and irreversible. As the noise outside Tesla's gates became a relentless drumbeat of voices demanding justice. Not stock prices, not vision statements, but air that could be breathed and children that could live. The myth of untouchability surrounding Elon Musk began to fracture. The morning air outside Tesla headquarters was thick, not with fog, but with the echoes of protest signs thudding against barricades and chants rising from lungs once silenced by corporate indifference. Across major news networks, footage rolled in from Austin, Reno, Buffalo, Hawthorne, cities once proud to host the Musk empire, now turned into epicenters of a reckoning. The names of the sick were no longer data points. They had become stories, and those stories were impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, executives whispered urgently. Stockholders panicked. Board members demanded strategy, but none of them were ready for what would come next. Not a legal settlement, not a marketing stunt, but something far more rare, a public surrender from the man who once called himself the architect of humanity's future. Musk stepped onto the press stage in silence. No signature smirk, no AI jokes, just a grim, pale stillness that said he had finally been cornered. Not by a competitor or market shift, but by consequence. The cameras zoomed in, protesters paused, and then into a microphone that had amplified endless predictions about Mars and cyborgs and digital utopias. Elon Musk said 6 words that stopped time. "We have to do better, immediately." The room exhaled. He continued, "For too long, we've talked about the future as if it were something clean, perfect, and bloodless. But the truth is, progress has casualties, and when those casualties are your neighbors, your kids, your lungs, that's not innovation. That's negligence." The words weren't smooth. They were jagged, stilted, but they were real. For the first time, Musk wasn't selling a product. He was admitting a failure. "I built companies to disrupt industries," he said, "but I refuse to let anyone disrupt me. That stops today." He lifted a document, a policy draft stamped with federal oversight seals and countersigned by members of Congress, including Jasmine Crockett herself. It was titled Sustainable Transition and Community Protection Framework, and it wasn't just a PR stunt. It was a binding set of reforms. Every Tesla and SpaceX facility would undergo environmental reevaluation. Independent scientific audits would no longer be optional. A new cap and account system would publicly log every ounce of pollution and every dollar spent on cleanup in real time. A compensation fund, starting at $750 million, would be created for families with proven exposure to site-related toxins. And perhaps most shocking of all, 3 planned megasites, each projected to net Tesla over $3 billion in revenue, were officially suspended until further public health studies were concluded. "I'm not proud of what brought us here," Musk said, his voice slightly breaking. "But if this is the price of course correction, then I accept it." He was just getting started. As he spoke, a slide behind him changed. Images of lithium extraction pits, once showcased as clean energy triumphs, now shown next to respiratory disease clusters and contaminated aquifers. The screen didn't sell hope. It admitted harm. And that shift, the willingness to reflect instead of deflect, staggered even his fiercest critics. Musk announced the immediate establishment of a new division within Tesla, Tesla Reclamation and Environmental Integrity, staffed not by engineers, but by epidemiologists, sociologists, and environmental justice advocates. Their sole task? To trace every link between Tesla's operations and public health outcomes. Every 6 months, a public hearing would be held. Not a press release, a hearing, with real community testimony, with live-streamed accountability. And it wasn't just Tesla. At SpaceX, launch pads would be redesigned with new noise abatement and pollution containment systems. Rocket fuel storage zones near residential neighborhoods would be relocated. The Boca Chica site, long accused of contaminating water tables, would be jointly managed with local environmental watchdogs and tribal councils. This is not charity, Musk said. This is course correction with teeth. Then, turning to the issue of energy, he pledged a shift in Tesla battery sourcing to rely exclusively on suppliers certified under new international labor and ecological standards. No more child labor mined cobalt. No more rivers poisoned for rare earths. The excuse that we need to break some eggs to make an omelet, he said, that was the language of tyrants. I see that now. At that moment, the room shifted again, not in applause, in disbelief. Could this be real? Some journalists later speculated that Musk had simply lost control of the narrative. Others said it was a strategy pivot wrapped in guilt. But in communities like Fremont, like Sparks, like the Navajo Nation, where kids had coughed for months and mothers had held photos instead of sons, this moment was seismic. Jasmine Crockett, watching remotely with her sleeves rolled and a stack of affidavits still warm from printing, didn't smile. She didn't celebrate, but she nodded, just once, because she knew that public pressure had bent one of the most powerful figures in the world to the will of the people, not through scandal, but through truth backed by science and sorrow. And then came perhaps the most unexpected part of Musk's speech. I've spent years trying to reach the stars, he said, but I ignored the ground I stood on. Going forward, no rocket launches unless the community approves it, no factory expansions unless public health experts certify it. No more pretending that efficiency justifies silence. He paused, then added, and if that means I lose a few billion, so be it. Humanity's future is worthless if it poisons the present. The room froze. His team shifted nervously. But outside, protesters grew quiet. Not out of forgiveness, but recognition. Change had finally spoken in the voice of power. In the hours that followed, social media ignited. Hashtags flipped from Narvi boycott Tesla to Nara hold them to it. Wall Street wobbled, but activists surged. And across America, in the places once buried under silence, you could hear something new, the grinding, rusty sound of accountability, finally starting to move. It wouldn't heal everything, it wouldn't bring back the lost, but it was real, and it had a name, policy, enforced, and irreversible. And as the echoes of Musk's public reckoning reverberated through boardrooms and courtrooms alike, a different kind of figure emerged, not with wealth, but with willpower. Not with rockets, but with resolve. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the storm, she became its architect. In the weeks that followed the congressional showdown, the media tried to shift focus. Some headlines ran with the novelty of Musk's reversal. Others latched onto Wall Street's unease, speculating about Tesla's share price or the logistical delays for SpaceX. But in the communities that had once screamed into the void, the spotlight stayed locked on one name, Jasmine Crockett. Not as a footnote, not as a partisan pawn, but as a force of nature who had stared down one of the most powerful men in the world and refused to flinch. Footage of her final remarks during the hearing flooded social media, re-uploaded in every language. Journalists called her the voice of the invisible. Parents in chemical-laced neighborhoods whispered her name with the same reverence once reserved for doctors or ministers. Children held up handmade signs reading, "Thank you, Jasmine," outside shuttered factories. And perhaps most telling of all, Other politicians began quoting her, awkwardly at first, as if still unsure whether this kind of conviction had a place in their sanitized scripts. But Jasmine wasn't waiting for their permission. While others basked in optics, she moved like a fire cutting through bureaucracy. Within 48 hours of the Musk hearing, she filed a proposal for the Community Protection through Corporate Accountability Act, a sweeping bill that would mandate environmental impact disclosures before any new tech infrastructure could be greenlit. It would require ongoing, real-time public reporting of emissions, noise levels, water usage, and human health metrics within a 5-mile radius of every major site. And most radically, it proposed that the communities themselves would have veto power. Not politicians, not executives. People. They called it the Crockett Doctrine. Critics called it radical. Lobbyists called it dangerous. But the public called it overdue. As Jasmine toured the country, Flint, Baton Rouge, Oakland, East St. Louis, she didn't arrive with entourages or polished speeches. She sat in school gymnasiums with leaking ceilings. She met with families over folding tables and paper cups of weak coffee. She didn't talk about the future in buzzwords. She listened to the present in heartbreak. One mother showed her a jar of cloudy water drawn from her kitchen tap. One boy wheezed through a mask while handing her a drawing of his dream, a garden where nothing died. Jasmine took every photo. She shook every hand. But more than anything, she wrote down names. Because policy to her wasn't ink. It was blood. And Washington began to tremble. The tech industry scrambled. PR campaigns ramped up, claiming green innovation. Legal teams fought to stall the bill, inserting loopholes and watered-down clauses. Billionaire PACs funneled millions to oppose her in the next election. But for every ad that painted her as anti-progress, 10 more grassroots groups rose in her defense. Jasmine Crockett had become more than a congresswoman. She was now a movement. Back in D.C., colleagues who once rolled their eyes now leaned in when she spoke. Her floor speeches no longer drew polite silence. They drew standing room crowds. Veteran lawmakers, jaded by decades of compromise, confessed in private that her fire had reminded them why they entered politics in the first place. But it wasn't easy. Behind the scenes, threats poured in. Security had to be tightened. Her staff, mostly young, mostly from communities like the ones she fought for, received anonymous warnings. One morning, a black SUV idled outside her office for 6 hours without explanation. But Jasmine refused to back down. "If they're watching," she said, "make sure they see this." And she taped to her window the names of every sick child she'd met in her travels, one by one, until the glass was no longer clear, but covered in the reasons she fought. Then came the true test, the first vote on the bill. The chamber was packed. Opponents whispered. Allies looked anxious. The air was brittle with tension. Jasmine rose, not with notes, but with resolve. She spoke not of Musk, not of politics, but of a 6-year-old girl in Buffalo named Amina, whose asthma had grown so bad she couldn't sleep lying down. "We don't need more visionaries," Jasmine said. "We need guardians, of breath, of water, of life." The room went still. And then, against all predictions, the first vote passed, not unanimously, but definitively. It was a seismic shift. The bill advanced to committee, and national debate erupted. Talk shows couldn't get enough. College students began citing her speeches in environmental science theses. One senator from Oregon referred to her as the Cassandra who didn't get ignored. But Jasmine dismissed the praise. She wasn't interested in iconography. She was interested in guarantees. So she went further. She launched the Health Equity Oversight Initiative, an independent watchdog funded by public grants and overseen by medical experts with no corporate ties. They would review corporate impact claims, verify health records, and publish quarterly findings accessible to the public. Not locked in PDF files, not buried in bureaucracy, projected on LED screens in community centers, available in 6 languages, updated weekly. "You shouldn't need a PhD," she said, "to know if your child's drinking water is poison." And it resonated. By year's end, 5 states had adopted pilot versions of her doctrine. A growing alliance of young legislators began mirroring her tone, rejecting polished ambiguity for surgical honesty. Jasmine's name appeared on more than just bills. It appeared in poems, in songs, and murals. Still, she never forgot the cost. She visited Amina again, this time with an inhaler courtesy of a new clinic opened near the neighborhood, funded directly by Musk's reparations fund. The girl smiled. Jasmine cried, not out of joy, but release, because for every policy passed, there were still scars, and she vowed never to mistake political victory for healing. At the United Nations, she delivered a keynote, not on carbon markets or economic incentives, but on pain, on the weaponization of delay, on how every month of inaction meant another child sick, another home emptied, another silence too loud to ignore. We measure progress in dollars, she said, but justice has always lived in lungs. The room stood for 5 full minutes, and as the cameras cut away and the world debated what came next, Jasmine Crockett walked off stage, not into celebration, but into another meeting, another fight, another sleepless night beside charts and case files and names. Because the job wasn't over. But for once, the tide was moving, and she was the one pulling it forward. And yet, as the storm quieted and legislation turned into law, what lingered wasn't just victory, it was the aching question behind every triumph. What kind of world had demanded this much pain just to listen? The lesson wasn't written in ink. It wasn't printed in the headline of a major paper or captured in a viral clip. The real lesson, the one that pulsed beneath Jasmine Crockett's every breath, was carved into the bruises of the unheard. It whispered from the walls of crumbling homes built too close to smokestacks. It bled through the silence of families who lost everything to an invisible toxin they couldn't spell but could feel in every cough, every diagnosis, every empty chair at the dinner table. And it shouted in Jasmine's ears every night she tried to sleep but couldn't stop hearing them, the voices of the forgotten. No amount of applause could drown them out. No standing ovation could replace the lives lost before anyone cared to ask why. The humanitarian lesson wasn't about Elon Musk. It wasn't even about power. It was about distance. The distance between those who create and those who endure. Between spreadsheets and suffering. Between technological ambition and the real bodies it scars. Musk had stood before Congress and talked about the big picture, as if progress required collateral. But Jasmine forced the nation to stare at the details, the fine print of injustice that hides behind innovation. And that changed everything, because the truth, the gut-wrenching, breath-stealing truth, was that for decades the poor had been paying the bill for progress. Their lungs absorbed the price of battery factories. Their bloodstreams carried the cost of clean energy. Their neighborhoods were lit by the flickering promise of a better tomorrow, even as their present collapsed under pollution, neglect, and lies. Jasmine knew that if humanity had a future, it couldn't be built on a foundation of sacrifice zones. So she reframed the question, not how do we make things faster, but who gets left behind when we do? Not can we afford environmental regulation, but can a child afford another asthma attack? She challenged a country addicted to convenience to confront its conscience. She asked, what is innovation worth if it comes at the cost of breathing? And for the first time, the room answered with silence. Not dismissal. The humanitarian lesson stretched further than policy. It reached into the personal. Jasmine's own staff, interns raised in trailer parks, aides whose parents had died before 50, watched her dismantle the lie that power belonged only to those who could afford it. They saw her reject cynicism. She didn't posture, didn't perform, she showed up. And that was a revolution in itself, because the world had taught young leaders of color, especially women, that their anger had to be sugar-coated to be heard, that their grief had to be sterilized to be taken seriously. But Jasmine didn't delude herself. She walked into that hearing with fire in her chest and sorrow in her eyes and said, this is who I am. This is who you ignored. And this is why I won't let you anymore. She weaponized truth. And in doing so, she taught an entire generation of activists a radical lesson. You do not need permission to protect your people. Beyond the hearing, community organizers took her name into town halls. Mothers referenced her words when demanding safer schools. One teacher in Arizona changed her curriculum to include environmental justice, not as theory, but as lived experience. A rapper in Detroit released a song that sampled Jasmine's voice saying, we are not disposable. A church in South Texas held a candlelight vigil in front of a Tesla distribution center, reciting the names of local residents who had died of respiratory illnesses. And on the steps of a courthouse in Nevada, a girl not yet old enough to vote held a handmade sign that read, "Progress without mercy is not progress at all." That was the lesson. Not that one woman could change the world alone, but that one woman could ignite the realization that it had to. Jasmine's struggle taught the nation that democracy was not about handshakes in marble corridors. It was about whose pain reached the podium. It revealed how too often corporations were allowed to write the story while the people lived the consequences. And it reminded every person watching that justice isn't theoretical. It's urgent, it's messy, it's fought for in rooms where no camera rolls. And it demands sacrifice, but it also demands vision. Jasmine didn't just want Musk to admit fault. She wanted to show that accountability and advancement weren't enemies, that a world where companies thrived without poisoning communities wasn't just possible, it was necessary. That clean energy didn't mean anything if it only cleaned up headlines. That green innovation had to start with clean hearts. And slowly, that lesson took root. Colleges began rethinking how they taught ethics and engineering. Grant committees started including health impact assessments. Journalists re-examined their coverage of tech moguls, no longer treating them as untouchable visionaries, but as citizens bound to the public good. And perhaps most profoundly, regular people, those who had long felt invisible, saw themselves reflected in power for the first time, not as charity cases, but as truth-tellers. Jasmine didn't offer empty hope. She offered a blueprint for resistance, for accountability, for a kind of future where people didn't have to beg just to survive the dreams of the rich. She showed the world that courage wasn't found in press releases or branding. It was found in telling the truth when it was least convenient. It was found in sitting across from a billionaire and saying, "Your vision ends where our lives begin." That was the humanitarian lesson. That progress must be rooted in humanity, not hover above it. That numbers don't bleed, but people do. That if we build a future without consent, without inclusion, without compassion, then we haven't built a future at all. And so the final image wasn't Jasmine holding a gavel or standing behind a podium. It was Jasmine walking alone in the dusk outside a community center, barefoot in the grass, talking to a grandmother whose backyard now had air monitors, thanks to Crockett's bill. The old woman held Jasmine's hand and whispered, "We thought no one saw us." And Jasmine, eyes brimming but voice steady, replied, "I see you. I always have. That is what they won't put in textbooks. That is what they can't monetize. But that is what changed the world." Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.